All right, visual effects, a cinematic summarization. Let's talk about it. So, because this is a water-themed event, we're going to talk about Avatar 2. How many of you have seen Avatar 2? Pretty much everyone, right? How many of you remember the plot of Avatar 2? Almost nobody. All right. It's a good movie, and everyone liked the special effects. But why are they so good? Let's talk about that. Let's answer the question of everything that they've done. It took 7 years of post-production to get this movie from beginning to end. That's a lot of time. So what did they do and how did they do it? Let's break it down from the beginning. Now, who am I? That's me. That is not my apartment. That's basically my apartment. March 2020, I was no longer able to watch movies in their theater. But as everyone remembers, so I had a lot of free time. I started talking with friends, and we did movie nights. I watched a lot of movies by myself. And visual effects artists, they like to brag. They like to show off what they've done. And so there's lots of interesting behind-the-scenes videos of how they do all these different effects. And I got really into that. And so now I'm going to talk about all the exciting things that I've learned through my time of watching movies and their behind-the-scenes. That's me, Nick Felker, right there. All right. So why do we even need visual effects? Why can't we just film things right where we are, on this stage, wherever? How many people are interested in seeing Oppenheimer? Yeah. Everyone, yeah, it's exciting, right? Nuclear bombs, all kinds of fun stuff. Those aren't fun, but the theme is fun, right? So why do we need visual effects? Well, as it turns out, this movie is not using CGI for the nuclear bombs. Christopher Nolan, he's a great director, right? I don't want him to have a nuke, but so we shouldn't give him one. So if you don't have anything else from this talk that you get, just remember this one thing. Visual effects is literally going to save us nuclear Armageddon. All right, so how are we going to do these things if you don't have CGI? Well, visual effects is a lot more than just some CGI. It includes CGI, of course, but then there's lighting. You've got to think about the camera, how that's going to work. Compositing, makeup, and miniatures. A lot of different things go into making these effects. And you don't always think about how those effects are being done. So I'm going to share some with you, and hopefully these videos will load. All right, come on, Dan. There you go. So even a movie like Parasite, it's a good movie. You might not realize how many scenes have visual effects in them. Things like 3D models, green screens, all kinds of sky replacement. There's a lot of hidden effects, and the cool thing about hidden effects is that they're so good that you don't realize they're visual effects. When you do realize they're visual effects, they're usually very bad. But it's all about telling a story, and I think that's the key thing from this talk. If the visual effects are getting in the way of telling the story, they're not doing a good job. Of course, from the dawn of time, dawn of cinema, we have had people who try to do visual effects. Something like A Trip to the Moon, 1902. This is like one of the first movies. And of course, this is not really what the moon looks like. But they tried to make something that looks like a moon. Kind of fun. Citizen Kane, another great movie. This is a really interesting scene right here. He's giving this talk in front of this audience. Now, did they hire what, 1,000 extras for this scene to sit there for 10 seconds? No, they didn't. Actually, it's a cool compositing effect where you have him in the foreground, all the audience is just a bunch of cutouts, and they have a piece of white paper. And so they move the white paper back and forth a little bit, which creates the effect of motion. So when you put everything together into one pane, it looks like there's actually people in the audience. Now that's a very early example of an effect that tricks your mind into thinking something is there without having to go through all the work of doing everything for real. Dante's Peak is another really cool movie, and I hope this loads. So, Look at that. Look at all those sticks, all that water flooding. Now the cool thing about this is it's all miniatures. This is a practical effect, but it's at about 1/10 of the normal scale. And the cool thing about miniatures is that when they're doing these effects, you have to film it in slow motion because otherwise the physics is going to get in the way. So they film this about 10 times as slow as normal, and then do everything back together a bit faster to get the effect that these are real cars. Well, they are real cars, right? But they're not human-sized cars. It's not human-sized sticks, human-sized water. A lot of explosions in movies will use miniatures to get the physics correct, but they are filmed in slow motion. Modern Times, Charlie Chaplin, great movie, 1936. Now look at this effect. So that looks pretty cool, right? He's going to fall. It's actually another compositing trick. By changing the way that things are in the foreground or the background, we're able to get the illusion that he's actually going to fall. And if he did, he'd be okay. He's not really going to fall that far. Now, Fantastic Voyage, this is from 1966. Now, you can see in this, they're going through a human body right now. They're miniatured, shrunk down. They're going through a human body. Now, one thing you can tell very clearly is that this is filmed on a green screen, or a blue screen. In the 60s, this chroma keys, blue screens, and green screens, these were just being pioneered at the time by being able to cut out the parts of the background and keep people in the foreground. Be able to replace the background with whatever you want. Unfortunately, I think a lot of us know examples where green screens are very obvious and they look quite bad. This is from Die Another Day, James Bond. Now, why does this look, we know all this is on a green screen. Why does it look bad? Because you can tell that the water is very bright. You have these solar highlights, but he looks very bland. You know, his face is flat. The motion looks pretty janky. There's a lot of problems here that are very obvious. Now, yeah, this is, and then of course the visual effects are getting in the way of telling the story. I'm sure we're all familiar with the concept of the uncanny valley. But the cool thing about the uncanny valley is that it applies to more than just human faces. If you're looking at something and the lighting is off, or the physics are off, we innately can tell that something is wrong. We can tell that it's a bad effect. And it's very hard for visual effects artists to get things to look good. And so they do a lot of things to try to mitigate that. One of them is high dynamic range imaging. Basically, they'll take these reflective balls into the scene where they're being filmed. And you can see in this reflection, you get colors, you get the right saturation, you get both the intensity of the light and the direction of the light. And so they can use this as a reference when they go back to the visual effects post-production and then apply that to the visual effects so that things look as they're supposed to. Now, another cool thing that they can do is use practical effects where you can. A movie like Real Steel, now see, the movie is about robots who fight, like boxing, and there's of course a lot of CGI to get robots to box. Robots cannot box today, thankfully. But they actually do build real robots, and they use them in a couple scenes. Not for the fighting, but when you have real things, visual effects artists can take that as reference. They know the types of metals, they know the shapes and the textures and the lighting and how that all works. So that when you get to the part where you do the CGI, it looks really good. This is one of the first movies where things looked photoreal. And that was a big deal at the time because they had a lot of these things planned ahead of time on how to achieve really good looking robots. We're getting a lot better at this kind of stuff today. So if you're familiar with video games, they're now working on these things like the volume. If you've ever seen Mandalorian, for example, they are now building these virtual environments. So when they're doing the filming, they're able to right away adjust the types of scenes, what's in the scenes, what the lighting is like. So instead of having to do everything on a green screen, everything is just being done right away. And that's really good for lighting as well, for colors, for everything. And it helps the director as well because they're not having to film something on a green screen, wait 3 months to see what it looks like afterwards. They can say, okay, right here, I want the sun to be a little dimmer, I want a little brighter, clouds, I want this thing moved. So that's a really new advancement in terms of achieving very good visual effects. The camera is also very key. You know, when we're watching a movie, we're watching it through the point of view of the camera. And sometimes a good director will use the camera as a character. And sometimes they can use these to achieve new types of effects. So Star Wars, they were headed by George Lucas, of course, Industrial Lights and Magic. They pioneered motion-controlled cameras. So basically to achieve all the different types of crafts in space, the crafts stay there. The camera moves in a deterministic way. They can repeat that same motion over and over, exactly as it is, and they can composite all the different spacecrafts together to create the effect that they're actually moving. And of course, I'm sure you're familiar with The Matrix and that famous bullet time scene. So to achieve this, they end up using about 3 dozen cameras, and they capture him in slow motion on a background that's actually CGI. And so to achieve this, they have each of the cameras take a small snapshot of him, and they actually use CGI, very early CGI, to do the morphs between each of those different cuts. And so when you do it all together, it actually looks like the camera is moving, even though every single camera is still. Now, Ambulance, this came out last year. I'm sure you're going to tell very quickly a very interesting thing about this type of camera. And see, no cameraman is actually going underneath the police car. That'd be too dangerous. So they're actually using drones, and I think we're beginning to see drones as a new medium to create types of shots that we've never seen before. So I think it's cool to see that cameras, even though we all understand what they are, we all have one, there's still a lot of innovation that we can achieve to get different types of shots. And of course, we have to talk about CGI characters. This is actually pretty hard to do. And Lord of the Rings introduced Gollum. He is one of the first photoreal CGI characters. Well, he wasn't that photoreal. But Andy Serkis ended up, he's there, he does all the different types of things on set. And they're hand animating everything that he does later on. This is 2002, and that was pretty good for the time. And it still holds up, but we can do a lot better. So what are we doing today? How have we advanced CGI characters? If you look at something like Avengers, came out a couple years ago, the character of Thanos is entirely CGI as well. Now what they do is a lot of motion capture. So you can see him, he's wearing a motion capture suit, and he has a lot of dots on his face with a small camera positioned right around his mouth. So to do that, everything he does, everything he says, they're able to capture all of those small changes in his face. And human faces, they're very complex. But they're able to capture all of those data points and translate it into the character of Thanos. But we're doing a lot more than just animated characters. Something like The Irishman, for example. So they have him got there, and so you can see that they're doing a lot of de-aging there physically in the camera as a new type of effect. And that was good. I think The Irishman de-aging was solid, right? But Disney's actually working on some new technology, employing machine learning and AI. And you can see that they're able to take the input video and apply a different mask on top, so to create effects of extra aging or de-aging. So So you can see that they're able to do a lot of neat stuff using that. Disney is also responsible for, I'm sure you might be familiar with deep fakes, using AI to impose different faces on other people. In the book of Boba Fett, Luke Skywalker appears as a character. They're using a double, who's someone who looks like him naturally and dressed up as him. And then they're able to use machine learning trained on him, Luke Skywalker, when he was young, and superimpose that face onto the stunt double. Now, this is all Hollywood up to this point. Hollywood has done a lot of cool things, but I also want to make sure I don't forget about Bollywood. So this is an Indian movie. It features Shah Khan. He's the small character. He's 4'8" in the movie. And the movie's about him finding himself, right? And you can tell he's very small. But Shah Khan, the actor, is actually 5'8". So how do they get him to look under 4 feet, under 5 feet? They do a lot of really neat stuff here. So you can look at the visual effects breakdown. This is a very short clip. So you can see that one of the things they're doing, green screen of course, they have elevated platforms. For each scene, they're doing at least 5 passes. So they have him, he's a little lower, and they can use that shot. And they have a blank plate. They have a crowd plate. That's 3 so far. But of course, there's a lot of complexity into doing this. So he has to have him doing his own scene by himself, and they have to superimpose all those things together, every frame, every scene. They do a really good job. It's a lot of work, though. I don't know why they chose him for that, but the movie's very good. So now we have to talk about Avatar 2. So Avatar 2, I talked about a lot of effects today. All of those effects come together to make this movie. As I said, it took about 7 years of work on the team to do all this stuff. It looks fantastic, of course. Most of the effects were led by Weta Digital. So they are responsible for a lot of super advanced effects that we see in a lot of movies. And they keep pioneering new stuff. To make this movie, as part of it, they received dozens of patents on all kinds of very nuanced things that you don't even think about. How do we manage virtual fluids, camera changes, all kinds of things, and it's super exciting, right? So something they do is performance capture. They have this giant warehouse where everything is done. And so they do everything with motion capture. Of course, they do a lot of stuff with the faces as well. So and then all the different types of actions like this, they're all done for real, right? So they're actually on this stage doing these things. That really draws out the performance of the actors. But then everything gets animated anyway. So Weta pioneered this new facial pipeline. This is another technology that they're doing with machine learning. So they take in the skin and the performance capture, and they're using machine learning to identify exactly how the skull and how the muscles would move to create those movements. And so they can take those changes and apply them to the digital character. Now, another thing that they pioneered from the first Avatar was the concept of a simulcam in virtual productions. And this is being used more and more. Basically, they can impose the CGI aspects into this small display, so the director, while they're doing it, can actually see what the final thing is going to look like, more or less. And that is really useful for the camera folks, because they have to know exactly where the beats are going to be to achieve the effect. It's great for the actors as well, because they can see exactly what they're supposed to be responding to, instead of everything being on a green screen and you're looking at people telling you something is. They can see where it is. Now, one of the things that they pioneered, what a digital did for this, is called Loki. So you can see it's a completely new water simulation pipeline that also incorporates things like hair movement, cloth movement, and how things interact between the air and water. And this is very complicated types of physics, and each frame is going to take an hour to render. So this is very physics intensive, but if you get this right, the effects look spectacular. Another thing is bubbles. Bubbles are not something you think about in terms of CGI, but you can tell that they have to incorporate, how do bubbles work? How does water work? So you can see when the creature moves their mouth into the water, all these bubbles have to come out. And that's part of their Loki system, where they have to physically calculate how oxygen interacts with water, and how does it form bubbles, how the bubbles move, and how does it affect everything else around it. And that's super advanced, and that's something that, they have patents for this now. Another thing that they did is eye lines. This is actually a really cool video, because it's when you're having physical actors on set and digital actors, it's quite hard to understand where the eye lines are supposed to be. So they have this small monitor. You can see this is coming down from the ceiling, which actually shows the character's eye line right there, and the movement as well of the digital character, so they can react upwards instead of looking straight at the person next to them. Recording underwater is also a very difficult thing that they spent a lot of time trying to figure out.
Came up with a system where we basically did a volume underwater.
So they have this giant underwater pool, and they figure out how to manage the actors both above ground, above water, and below water, and doing them both sometimes simultaneously. Now this all really comes together in a lot of different ways, and like this one effect, in this load, you can see it's a mix of there's real stuff on set, there's a lot of CGI on set, there's CGI legs.
Wow.
Yeah. So the things like you have to interact with the water, and the water is CGI, so you can't have real legs.
It's insane.
You have to do a lot of mixture. I talk to you about a lot of effects, but when you're really making a movie, you can't just pick one and stick with it. So they really spend a lot of time, and there's multiple parts of that, even that scene, where they're applying a lot of different effects simultaneously. Ultimately, I want to say that this is all in service of the story, right? It's great to show off all the cool things that they've done, but it's all to tell a better story. And if the visual effects don't tell that story, they're just bad visual effects. No matter how photoreal they are, no matter how bad they might be, you have to remember why you're doing it. So I want to say thank you. Any questions? All right, questions. You in the back.